Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the New York Botanical Gardens Science, Conservation, and Humanities webinar, supported by our dear friends at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We are very pleased that you are joining us today from across the country and abroad for Queering Botanical Science, a discussion in celebration of LGBTQ plus Pride Month. I'm Carrie Barrett, president of the New York Botanical Garden, and it is my honor to have you join us for an in-depth exploration of how LGBTQ histories intersect with plant research and science. Our convening today is all the more timely after the Supreme Court's historic decision just last week on June 15th that the 1964 Civil Rights Act applies to and protects gay, lesbian, and transgender employees from discrimination based on sex. This has enormous implications in our world. Many botanical and library collections, including those at the New York Botanical Garden, contain rich stories of individual botanists who transgressed the gender and sexual norms of their day. Today, discussions of their scientific endeavors provides a new window into thinking through sexualized discourse about plants and people and modern botanical science. It's my pleasure to be with you today, to be joining our distinguished panel, and an extra pleasure now to introduce our moderator and convener, Nuala Quivenoch, currently a PhD candidate at NYU and a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. Nuala spent last year with us at the New York Botanical Garden as an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in the Garden's Humanities Institute. She worked on her dissertation, The Rise of Phylogenics in an Age of Climate Change, a study that focuses on plant evolution and ecology in Madagascar. We are very, very happy to welcome her back. I love that. I'm welcoming you to the Botanical Garden, even though none of us are at the Botanical Garden, not even me, but I'm welcoming you in this Zoom conference. Nuala is going to introduce speakers and take us through this wonderful hour on this very, very important day in this celebratory month. Welcome, Nuala, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, just a few technical details. You are muted, the audience are muted for the duration of this presentation, but after his presentation, we'll open up the floor for brief short answer questions from the audience, leaving more in-depth questions and answers until the end of the session. You may add questions to the chat at any time during the talks and Q&A, but if you're experiencing any technical issues or have difficulty hearing, please use the chat feature or send Charles Zimmerman an email. His address is in the chat window. As a reminder, this presentation will be recorded, archived, and shared online in the NYBG Humanities Institute Lecture Library. I am absolutely thrilled to convene this important webinar. So thank you to the speakers and to Carrie, to Vanessa Sellers and the team of the Humanities Institute, along with my collaborator, Rashad Bell of the Mertz Library. Thank you all for attending this digital webinar. I'm not sure exactly where any of you are, but I'm convening here in New York City within Lenape-Hoking, the homelands of the Lenape peoples. I'm excited about the talks for lots of reasons, not only because it's interdisciplinary scope, but to queer botanical science is a critical turning point. The word or category of queer has evolved over time and place and continues to do so. Queer began as a synonym for odd, strange, weird. Soon it became a homosexual slur, and then a politically charged adjective, verb, and noun. Most often, it is used as an expansive term for all non-heterosexual identities. In queer theory, however, it is often used as a verb. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the verb queer means to spoil, to destroy, to scupper. This verb is used to interrogate social categories, such as gender or race, to question the invention of dichotomies and binaries, and to probe the stability of subject matter that seems so innate and so natural, it seems almost without a history. Whilst this theory has emerged from contemporary discussions of gender and sexual identities, looking through the lens of queer is to challenge any essentialist way of viewing things. From filing specimens in folders separated into a geographic color scheme that replicates colonial racial categories, to lab coats that are white, to the governing metaphors embedded in the natural world, such as Mother Nature. Therefore, to queer botanical science means highlighting the disjunctures, resistance, outliers, and exceptions between how humans frame plants and what actually happens in the botanical world. Data immediately creates noise. Things that will not quite fit into delimited and containable models and neat definitions, such as male and female. Noise disrupts linear narratives of modern scientific theories, such as Charles Darwin's theory of sexual selection. This requires scientists over time to make choices to flatten, marginalize, or to ignore in the name of upholding or reinforcing grand narratives of a modern, progressive, objective science. Plants are queer, you should know, and people are queer, you should know. And plants and people are intricately linked. Cultural institutions such as the NYBG elevate plant diversity and the conservation of global biodiversity. But we must equally elevate human diversity, from the LGBTQ to Black Lives Matter to Indigenous cultures and to other groups yet unknown to us that are marginalized today. They have all been equally flattened to maintain a single history and a single vision of the natural world. Today's speakers will engage with some of these noisy and disruptive corners in an effort to open up a discussion and deepen our understanding of not only the natural world, but of those who engage with it. We are merely scratching the surface here today to open the doors to hearing other voices and experiences and knowledge about humans and plants. It is with great pleasure to introduce these incredible speakers today: Matthew Pace, Luis Campos, Netanya Meeker, and Antonia Sabara. Our first speaker is Matthew Pace. Matthew is an assistant curator at the William and Linda Steer Herbarium at the New York Botanical Garden. His research focuses on the megadiverse orchid family, Orchidaceae. You may have heard of him. His current research efforts include writing a monograph on the genus Spiranthes and a reorganization of the herbarium. It's hard to imagine how huge that task is, as it's the largest in the Western Hemisphere. He's doing this to update the family level classification. His presentation is entitled Pride in the Field, the LGBTQ Legacy of the NYBG. Over to you, Matthew.
Thank you. Thank you to Vanessa, Nuala, and the other organizers from the Humanities Institute for the invitation to speak. Given the current moment in which America finds itself, it's important to recognize that museums, libraries, and cultural institutions play a critical role in supporting the fight for a more just society, including efforts to tell the stories of those who have been marginalized. Here, I want to delve a little deeper into one particular story to highlight the role of the LGBTQ community at NYBG in the history of botany. Perhaps the most visibly out botanist of the 20th century was Rupert Barnaby. Born in 1911 in Wales to a wealthy branch of the landed English Barnabys of Brockhampton, Rupert Barnaby was not allowed to formally study botany, and instead read modern languages at Trinity College, Cambridge. Decades later, reflecting on his self-taught botanical knowledge and lack of a PhD, Barnaby is quoted as saying, "I am an autodidact, but that doesn't mean I don't know." Soon after graduating, Barnaby was disinherited by his father. This was in response to Barnaby's orientation, his open relationship with the wealthy American Dwight Ripley, pictured at right, and his rejection of the three occupations that his father had deemed acceptable for a man of his class: the Army, the Navy, or the Church. As described in Douglas Crace's excellent article, quote, his father summoned him to Hyde Park instead of their family estate. "Relinquish the attachment," he said, "and come home as before. Otherwise, never return." It is unknown if the attachment was directed at Botany or his relationship with Ripley, or more likely both, but Barnaby never saw his father again. Rupert and Ripley settled in Sussex, and the pair traveled throughout the Mediterranean and Mexico, seeking new species of plants to cultivate in their expansive rock garden. However, with the looming outbreak of World War II, Barnaby immigrated to America with Ripley in 1939. After a few years in California, Barnaby and Ripley eventually settled in New York, living at the intersection of the scientific community and the burgeoning mid-century bohemian art scene, where they became early patrons of Jackson Pollock, pictured at left, and other abstract expressionist painters. Employing the vocabulary of the time, within the letters and diaries of this bohemian circle, including those of Peggy Guggenheim, pictured at right, Barnaby and Ripley are routinely described as pals. Barnaby's relationship with the garden began in 1943, when Henry Allen Gleason asked him to write treatments for the genera Astragalus and Oxytropis for Gleason's Illustrated Flora of the United States and adjacent Canada. Embraced by garden scientists such as Gleason and Bassett McGuire, and collecting widely over the Western United States with Ripley, Barnaby expanded his encyclopedic knowledge of the beans, Fabaceae, becoming a world authority on this challenging family. Over 6,500 pages of elegant prose, Barnaby described an astounding 1,100 new species of plants from North and South America. Simply put, Barnaby is one of the most productive and most important of all botanists, his work having helped lay the foundation for biodiversity research in the Western Hemisphere. I became aware of Barnaby's immense legacy when I first came to the garden, and I consider Barnaby to be a personal hero, both because of his botanical contributions and the way he lived his life. However, Barnaby died while I was in high school. Trying to get a better sense of the man himself, I asked Jackie Kolunke, curator emerita of the herbarium, if Barnaby ever reflected on his life lived out of the closet, or if he was ever the recipient of discrimination from the botanical community. Jackie replied, "I think Rupert just lived his life as he had become accustomed to do. I don't think he felt the need to analyze it. He never mentioned, nor did I ever hear, that anyone in the botanical world treated him poorly because he was gay. Only his father." I do remember his recalling the upsetting incident in which his German lover was sent back to Germany from England and disappeared. Although it's unknown what happened to his German lover, this occurred just before World War II, and we should remember that up to 15,000 LGBTQ people were condemned to concentration camps, and homosexuality remained a crime in West Germany until 1969. Barnaby, despite his success, was a profoundly humble and generous researcher. For him, it seems the research was the most important thing to consider, not the researcher. It's important to remember that despite an unconventionally open life lived out of the closet and his bohemian circle of friends, Barnaby was a gentleman product of Edwardian and World War II era Britain, where men of wealth and position generally eschewed notoriety or publicity. One overriding aspect of LGBTQ history is that it's hidden, and queer people have mostly been forced to hide their private lives in order to survive within the wider society. I'm always struck when I read that a queer scientist discarded their private papers before they died, as is the case with both Barnaby and Alexander von Humboldt, the father of biogeography. Compare this to Charles Darwin, whose personal letter archive provides a rich well of insight into his research and views on important issues of the day. What contributions from the queer community, even those from privileged positions, have been lost because of past injustices? As scientists, we are always taught to take yourself out of your research, to make your research non-personal. This mantra is meant to inoculate your research from your own biases. So I must admit that although I was extremely happy to be part of this discussion, The process of creating this presentation put me in the unusual and privileged position of talking about LGBTQ botany as an LGBTQ botanist. This invitation also afforded me the opportunity to reflect on my own experiences, and I came to the realization that I have what I fondly refer to as one of the queerest academic lineages in botany. My graduate school advisor, Ken Cameron, as well as his advisor, Mark Chase, are both out botanists, and several of my closest colleagues, from grad school friends to co-authors and co-workers, are also queer. When discussing this seminar with Ken and Mark, both men specifically mentioned that they were fortunate to have met Barnaby, describing him as unfailingly kind and delightful. In closing, I return to Barnaby. One of my personal favorite Barnaby excerpts is a discussion of Astragalus reflexus from his monumental 1964 Atlas of American Astragalus. Quote, "The Texas milk vetch, which must appear to the casual or uninstructed eye an inconsiderable and trifling weed, cannot fail to excite the admiration of anyone who has paused to ponder the mysterious impulses which has given rise to the protein variations on the astragalene motif. The flowers seem to be the product of a sportive fancy operating outside the realm of common evolutionary pressures." Although I doubt Barnaby intended his words to be analyzed as such, I find a distinctly queer voice making itself known. By queer voice, I mean an appreciation of the overlooked, a reflection on the sportive fancies of nature, and a clear appreciation for the different and the unexpected. I also see connections between his vivid discussion of Astragalus reflexus flowers and the abstract expressionist movement in which he engaged, his words capturing the emotional intensity botanists often feel towards their botanical subjects, placing nature itself as the ultimate artist. More broadly, Barnaby wrote queerness directly into botany, using the language of nomenclature and the physicality of specimens. Thousands of specimens held at the NYBG Steer Herbarium bear the joint names of Barnaby and Ripley, and Barnaby named 8 species after Ripley, including the very first species he described, Cymopterus ripley. Barnaby's 57-year relationship with the garden blazed the path for future generations of LGBTQ botanists. Many stories remain to be told, and following the direction of Barnaby, I encourage us to continue delving into the wellspring of specimens and monographs and the stories they contain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. What a way to start. This is incredible, so thank you. This talk was fascinating, and as we go on this journey, it's I know we're gonna have a lot of questions, so I'm excited. Our next speaker is Luis Campos. He is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of New Mexico. Luis's research brings together archival discoveries with contemporary fieldwork at the intersection of biology and society. He has written widely on the history of genetics and is the author of a really brilliant book, just go by it, called Radium and the Secret of Life, and he's a co-editor of Making Mutations, Objects, Practices, Contexts, which contains this study that he's going to actually be talking about today. His presentation is titled Mutant Sexuality, the Private Life of a Plant and Those Who Studied It. This is a path-breaking attempt to integrate the history of biological mutation with queer theory in the early 20th century. Thank you so much, Luis. Over to you.
Great. Thank you, Nuala. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Great. So I want to take us back to the dawn of the 20th century and tell you a queer little story about a group of men who studied the evening primrose, Xenothera lamarckiana, and who ended up inventing and developing our modern concept of mutation. So our modern ideas of mutation date to around 1901, with the creation of the mutation theory, you see an English translation here, which held that a new species could arise from a parent species in the space of just one generation in a sudden evolutionary jump. So this theory was developed by the Dutch botanist you see here, Hugo de Vries, who discovered what appeared to be recognizably different species growing in his garden and appearing in the space of just a generation. So this plant, its sexuality, and in particular the unusual behavior of its chromosomes, lay at the center of what would become fiery debates surrounding heredity and evolution for over 2 decades. There's something very queer about de Vries's goings-on, and I wonder if he will not get us all into trouble someday, remarked William Bateson, the man who would later coin the word genetics in 1905. So the plant is not the only queer organism in this story. Tales of de Vries's own adventures, and particularly his frequent travels with a young male paramour and other male friends, circulated in a community for whom his sexuality was apparently an open secret. And I have found it especially striking to learn that no fewer than 3 of his most knowledgeable contemporaries in the study of mutations and some of his staunchest supporters also had private lives no less complicated than Oenothera itself. So this brotherhood of men included de Vries's student, Theodore Stomps, the renowned Canadian cytologist Reginald Ruggles Gates, and the young American botanist Harley Harris Bartlett. These strongest proponents of the mutation theory, who you see here from about 1900 to 1940, argued for the biological and also the social importance of these queer mutants of Oenothera that they were studying. So de Vries himself had believed that understanding the laws of heredity could help to solve social problems, and that an understanding would, he said, doubtless bring about a milder judgment of one's fellows and greater mutual respect, and thus contribute to the increase of happiness and contentment of all humanity. And in an essay that he wrote called Unity in Variability, he proclaimed, "It is indeed the aim of all branches of science to promote the happiness of one's fellow men." So de Vries was 50 years old when he met the promising student, Theodore Stomps, to whom he was something of a father figure. So I'm going to, there we go, okay. Stomps was probably gay himself, but what I want to highlight about his story is a speech that he gave decades later in 1935 when he was Rector Magnificus of the University of Amsterdam, and a speech that clearly shows de Vries's continuing influence. So in an address on the mutation theory and its significance for society, Stomps offered some words about homosexuality. And he said that this was a fairly obvious biological phenomenon for any biologist who had been trained in heredity. And he concluded that mutations can cause, at the most unexpected moments, homosexuality. He told the university audience that there is about homosexuality nothing secretive, nothing shameful, and he concluded by hoping that the Minister of Justice would amend the statutes so that homosexuals would have some of the same rights as heterosexuals. So there's more I could say about this case, including the public response, but what I want to point out right now is that early supporters of the mutation theory were making political claims for the rights of certain kinds of mutant people based on what they understood about biological variation. In my second case of the queer interconnections between plants and people, we have to turn a bit more into the microscope and efforts to unravel the complexities of Oenothera. Since it was so hard to understand just what was going on with its chromosomes, many opponents thought that de Vries should give up on the plant as the wrong model organism. Its hereditary patterns didn't easily fit with principles of Mendelism, and by 1915, as classical genetics in fruit flies and Drosophila was really taking off, the plant was widely said to be degenerate, subsexual, or queer. So although Oenothera's chromosomes did not always pair up with each other, they could join in many alternative ways, end to end, forming complex rings. And in so doing, they created a radically different type of hereditary mechanism that produced variation simply by chromosomal rearrangement and reattachment, with no change in genes, which is usually what we think of when we say mutation today. So this behavior was also seen to account for the appearance of recognizably distinct new species in the space of one generation, just what de Vries had seen in his experimental garden. And one of the first investigators to reveal this complicated pattern here was the Canadian cytologist Reginald Ruggles Gates, who's here at the upper right, and who wrote the book on this phenomenon, as you see here, The Mutation Factor in Evolution. So while critics had said that Oenothera had a mismating of parts that resulted in what they called an aberrant form of reproduction, Gates suggested that this kind of reproduction, and even asexual reproduction, was a curious but understandable possible implication of the mutation theory, that sex was not necessary for producing novel variation. Gates even proposed that sexual attraction might not be necessary for love. What applies to plants applies to persons, he said. You can't draw an antithesis between love and ideas of heredity. In fact, it was reported that he had suggested that a couple of young persons who begin to feel heart palpitations when they meet might well spend an evening studying each other's pedigrees instead of holding hands under the family snapshot album. There is no reason, he said, why love should not be intelligent. If you have a knowledge of heredity, it naturally will be a factor in determining whom you love. So for his part, Gates fell in love with a young Marie Carmichael Stopes, a paleobotanist whom some of you may recognize for her later efforts and family planning efforts in the UK. They married in 1911, but theirs was not a happy marriage. Soon after we arrived in London, as husband and wife, Gates told a friend, she handed me one morning a copy of a small volume of love letters just published describing her affair with a Japanese lover. Gates's idea that sex was not necessary for love had not sat well with his new wife, who rapidly became dissatisfied with their married life and who began to educate herself on what a woman might reasonably expect in a marriage, having entered into it with virtually no idea herself. So Stopes ultimately demanded a divorce from Gates and an annulment on the grounds of impotence, and then finally went public using thinly veiled references to her sexless marriage as a springboard for her sex activism manual, Married Love, in 1918, and her eugenical family planning efforts. In this book, she wrote, "I speak to those who are normal and who are married or about to be married, and hope but do not know how to make their marriages happy and successful. In my own marriage," she said, "I paid such a terrible price for sex ignorance that I feel that knowledge gained at such a price should be placed at the service of humanity so that it may save them years of heartache and blind groping in the dark." It was just in the midst of all of this that Gates was attempting to solve the question of how mutants of Oenothera, with chromosomes that did not properly pair up with their partners during a process that was called conjugation at the time, could nevertheless be responsible for these viable and recognizably distinct mutations and mutant species in Oenothera. And so even as he and Stopes were divorcing in 1916, Gates was insisting that the pairing of chromosomes, even if it didn't work out, these queer mutants could get along just fine and reproduce in their own way. And after all, Oenothera was quite evolutionarily successful. So other young DeFriesians were also very excited by Gates's work, including a young H.H. Bartlett, who was recognized already by 1912 for having conducted what were understood to be the most critical taxonomic studies on Oenothera in the Americas. He worked at the Gray Herbarium at Harvard for about 3 years, at the Bureau of Plant Industry until 1915, and then he spent the rest of his career ascending the ranks at the University of Michigan. And one biography also reports he was the only American ever adopted by a tribe of cannibals in Sumatra in 1918. But going through his papers, I read letter after letter that referred to his status as a confirmed bachelor. "I should be glad to have some word of you personally," one correspondent would write. "You tell very little of yourself and doings." And another, "1 or 2 personal questions which please don't overlook. Are you married? I have heard rumors to that effect." And one senior cytologist tried to entice Bartlett away from the primrose path, and he said, "I want to assure you that married life is the acme of human happiness. Come on in, the water's fine." Bartlett never married, but he was one of DeFries' strongest supporters, stronger even than Gates. "The more I see of the Oenotheras," he said, "the more convinced I become of the truth of the mutation theory." And he was working on a phenomenon called mass mutation. He wrote to DeFries regularly, and the two even went on a collecting trip together through Alabama in October 1912, and that's where these pictures are from. "I cannot tell you," he wrote, "how much I have enjoyed and appreciated the opportunity to be with you these last 2 weeks," he said to DeFries. "I wish only that the time might have been longer." And DeFries wrote back, "Those most delightful days which we spent together at Mobile and Castleberry, and which I consider to be the best part of my last trip through America. How I longed to cross the sea once more." Other letters and photos, it seems, were destroyed. The botanist who first introduced these two men became increasingly concerned about the adherence of young investigators to DeFries and his controversial mutation theory. And in an article published in Science magazine in 1914, it was written that the younger generation of biologists should take heed lest the primrose path of dalliance lead them imperceptibly into the primrose path to the everlasting bonfire. So it's not clear whether we're still talking about primroses here or something else. So what can we say about the interrelations among the degenerate sexuality of the evening primrose and its investigators? So whether de Vries was hanging out with Oenothera lamarckiana, as you see here, or with Amorphophallus titanus, history is sometimes queerer than fiction, de Vries was part of a small brotherhood of researchers who were both exploring and defending the mutation theory, and who themselves had some connection with the queer mutants that they studied, and who questioned the dominant gene-centered, Mendelian, and often animal-based approaches to try to understand how heredity actually took place in an evolutionarily significant and widespread plant genus. Careful work exploring the nature of Oenothera's chromosomes did not so much disprove the mutation theory or show that Oenothera was an inappropriate model organism, as expose the biases that closeted these other forms of heredity that dared not speak their name. So the case of Oenothera then is queer in more ways than one. Its mutants demonstrated a form of reproduction that was widely recognized as being queer. Its mutants were studied by scientists who were, at least in several instances, themselves queer. And the queer phenomena that Oenothera demonstrated were mobilized as both personal and public resources in battles to recognize the full extent of natural variation among chromosomes and their behavior in plants and potentially in people. So this wasn't a degenerate or a subsexual species, but it was a queer one. And so were some of the men most involved in studying it. And so when we look at a photo like this of de Vries standing next to his own beloved Oenothera, we should always stop to ask ourselves then, which one is the queer mutant? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis. This is just fascinating. Our next speakers. There will, I promise, be an opportunity to ask questions after our next talk. But I want to introduce to you Natanya Meeker and Antonia Sabari, both associate professors of French and comparative literature at the University of Southern California. They are co-authors of the newly released, another book you must get, Radical Botany, Plants and Speculative Fiction, which we all just learned is the winner of the 2019 Science Fiction and Technocultural Studies Book Prize. This is amazing, so congratulations. Today, they're going to speak on botanies for libertines. Over to you, Natanya.
Thank you. I'm going to briefly start here. Thank you, Carrie, Nuala, and Vanessa for welcoming us to the New York Botanical Gardens in this forum. And I will mention what it might entail to meet there in this forum a little later. Matthew Pace and Luis Campos have beautifully described different lives that suggest how humans use plants to affirm queer pleasures and to explore modes of non-heteronormative intimacy. So far, our starting point for this exploration of the idea of queer botany has been Darwinian evolutionary science, which emphasizes the flexibility and mutability of organisms and the continuities that link different life forms to one another. This focus on life as adaptation and change made it possible for queer people, in the cases we have been learning about, gay men, to think of sexuality as more flexible than social norms of their times would have it. Scientific practice also becomes its own space of pleasure and connection in the lives of these men. And I'm going to give Natanya the word from here, the podium, so to speak.
In our brief talk today, we'd like to discuss a history of queer entanglements with plants that has older pre-Darwinian roots, beginning in the 17th century and continuing on into the present, albeit often in cryptic or clandestine ways. In our remarks, we would like to take you back more than 2 centuries before the Darwinian Revolution to explore a moment when men and women in 17th century Europe were imagining, thinking about, and studying plants, different from humans, but nonetheless vibrantly alive, as a source of new ways of cultivating, understanding, and experiencing pleasure. This moment coincides with the rise of a scientific practice that we might now characterize as modern. But it is also a time before the disciplinary specialization that is typical of scientific study today, when art, literature, philosophy, and botanical science were in constant conversation with one another. It witnesses the birth of what we will refer to as libertine botany, a mode of thought and practice carried out by early modern botanical thinkers who did not self-identify as gay or lesbian, since these categories did not yet formally exist, but who turned to the plant world as a place where pleasure and desire did not take recognizably human forms, and who often found there not just queer intimacies, but an embrace of queer desires in their most unsettling and dynamic modes. These authors and scientists were inspired in their writing and in their lived experience by what they observed among the plants, including a certain vegetal resistance to being fully understood through analogies to human sexuality or sexual life, but also by the way in which vegetal life forms move, change, travel, and even carry out their own relationships with other beings according to a logic that is not the one informing human institutions. From a modern vantage, we can see the ways in which these libertine botanists' relationships with plants, not just in science, but in art and literature too, enable an approach to pleasure more generally that includes non-normative and specifically non-heteronormative possibilities. There is a gap between human and plant that may be momentarily crossed or bridged by pleasure without collapsing the one mode of being into the other. We might even say that Charles Darwin himself was the product of this older tradition of libertine botany, one that is resolutely pre-Darwinian. And in fact, it predates even Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's scandalous grandfather. What do we mean by libertine botany? First, it is an archive of texts and images that have not always been considered together and that span a variety of linguistic and national traditions. It is also an approach to the critique of norms and institutions that highlights the capacity of pleasure to move, shape, and animate bodies, both human and non. Some of the libertine botanists we are interested in include authors like Guy de Labrosse, shown here, who was known for his unorthodox approach to scientific research, which he believes should be undertaken without regard for dogma and with a strong commitment to experimental practice, and for his links to a group of materialist thinkers who were pushing the boundaries of philosophy and questioning religious and political conventions. Labrosse is mentioned in the work of another author, Savinien de Cyrano de Bergerac, who in the 1640s writes a joyous fantasy tale of journeying to the moon and sun that is laced with depictions of homoerotic and what we would now call queer pleasure. Plants are key players in the cosmos that Cyrano explores in his tales, and their ways of being and connecting with one another are not subject to containment by human conventions. When he travels to the sun, Cyrano's narrator encounters the talking oaks of Dodona, who have journeyed as acorns to the sun, have their own language, and tell tales of metamorphosis inspired by Virgil and Ovid, in which men love other men, women love women, fathers love daughters, women love animals, and men love plants, among many other possibilities and permutations. Both Cyrano and Labrosse were influenced by the work of Pierre Gassendi, who reworks the Aristotelian doctrine of the vegetal soul as a material and corporeal substance that infuses the plant. The heat or flame of this soul might be seen as analogous in the writings of Labrosse and Cyrano to the heat or flame of pleasure that galvanizes both humans and plants in different and unexpected ways. Plants, as Cyrano suggests in this quote from his correspondence with a lovely description of a cypress tree, put the earth in contact with the sky. They body forth the continuities linking all material beings to one another, pleasure being one of the most important of these. Libertine botany was not limited to the realm of men philosophers and literary authors, however. We could also mention Margaret Cavendish in this context, whose reflections on plants lend a wisdom to vegetables without necessarily subtracting from that of humans. In her speculative fictions too, Cavendish is interested in the way in which different bodies, including women's bodies, can inhabit and inform one another, moving, mutating, and transforming according to the principles of atomic philosophy, as well as what we might call a kind of queer fancy And here I'm reminded of the sportive fancy of Barnaby, that wonderful phrase. We should note that these 17th century thinkers predate not only 19th century Darwinianism, but 18th century Linnaean schemes for sexual classification. We find in this somewhat earlier period both the capacity to envision erotic forms of intimacy involving botanical entities and the idea that plants were largely non-sexual, at least if sexuality is considered in human terms. But an absence of sex does not necessarily mean an absence of desire or pleasure. Botany here is again a space where authors whose lives or pleasures we might now call queer could find a certain freedom to explore different kinds of connections with both human and non-human bodies, even as they drew from the understanding that humans are not the same as plants. Indeed, it is this realization that makes plants such productive co-conspirators and interlocutors for queer thinkers, authors, and artists, including today. Later scientists would try their best to map plant lives onto human ones, in particular Carl Linnaeus, who was profoundly conservative in matters of desire and sexuality, and Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus, who was considered scandalous by his contemporaries for his embrace of the erotic dimensions of botany in the mode of plant marriages. The 17th century libertine thinkers we have just discussed establish a clandestine tradition that works against this mapping, but even so informs and energizes human desires, often in queer directions.
I apologize for the slow glitch. Nathaniel has told us that to many early modern authors, those that are somewhat problematically called libertines, which is also a stigmatizing label given to them. The non-heteronormative sexuality of plants includes a potential, or included a potential for queer aesthetics and for often clandestine but still powerful forms of queer self-expression. For a long time, botany was seen as a source of this transgressive self-expression. But what I want to indicate here in this last bit is that it slowly morphs into something else, solidifies into something like a language or a technology. In the last bit of my presentation, I would like to talk about one specific modern affinity between LGBTQ culture and the botany and aesthetics of these older libertines, namely the gap that separates plants as material bodies and humans becoming available as a queer language or technology of connection, one that connects embodied humans and creates speculative futures, or in the early 20th century, inspires emerging speculative technologies, including film. Early 20th century botanical science was very taken up with the study of plant movement or tropisms, which were initially studied by Charles Darwin and his son Francis, and also by the German botanist Julius von Sachs, the Darwin's nemesis. Thanks in part to the development of imaging technologies like photography, film, microphotography, and time-lapse photography. Plant movement, as revealed by the eye of the camera, was taken to be not only a form of scientific evidence, but also an insight into a material reality that does not conform to the established categories of human reason and experience. And now I come to my first set of examples for French film theorists and filmmakers, Jean Epstein and Germain Dulac. Time-lapse images of plants inspire a queer perception of reality. These authors were not out in the modern sense, although they were gay and lesbian authors, but they turned to plants as catalysts for visions of queer pleasures and queer publics. Germaine Dulac, who is best known for her experimental cinema, but also wrote screenplays, film theory, and directed documentaries, saw botany as a realm of embodied material life that is at a certain remove from the human because it presents us with a non-human shape while remaining accessible for deployment within human affective relationships. In one of her film essays, Dulac writes of the time-lapse images of the germination of a seed by describing them as translating, I quote, the vegetal being's anguish by erratic rhythms that will change the meaning of the movement and its rhythms, and will have determined the emotion, the purely visual emotion. The plant body presents us with a new non-human geometry of the body, one that can then be mapped onto the human line with transfigurative effects. For an example of how this process might work, I will not turn to her films, but to sketches that Dulac's lover, the dancer Stasia Napierskova, dedicated to Dulac. In these sketches, Napierskova labels depictions of her own body with the vegetal terms tendril or shoot. Likewise, Jean Epstein also made vegetal movement the source of queer relationality. In his beautiful black and white film, Finistère, set on a small island off the coast of Brittany, where two young men journey to harvest kelp. Their erotic relationship is entangled with the kelp that they scoop laboriously from the sea and shovel on the land. And in a moment of playfulness, as you can see in this still, one of them waves kelp to the other, evoking in his gestures the director himself wrestling with strips of film. In contemporary culture and in Pride Month, when LGBTQ+ people demand visibility and recognition through play and performance, and have been doing so for at least half a century now, we can ask, what is the meaning of returning to these earlier clandestine moments of communicating through plant languages, which strikes me as one of the themes that all our talks address here. One point that is important, and I can only emphasize this for a shortness of time, is the need for technologies of connection, which renders relevant these unknown languages of plants, to recall Cyrano's oaks here. And here I evoke one more artist, the online performance art installation by Benny Nemirovsky-Ramsey, entitled Trees Are Fags, which speaks to this question, it seems, and which you can peruse later. Just briefly, on this website, Ramsey invites the viewer to walk through a wooded area, first an exotic sylvan space of the past, then a city park or a botanical garden, like the one where we are invited now, or even the garden of our memories, in a meditative guided tour through the history of gay men cruising, where etymologies of the word faggot and the pyres used in the past to burn women accused of witchcraft come together. I cite, "Do you remember," says the voice, "when trees were the only refuge for our desires? Trees have provided an architecture for gay sex since time immemorial, long before geopositioning software, before dating sites and ads, before penal colonies, before bedrooms, before beds." End of citation. Interpolating any willing viewer, the oblique movements guided by trees, through the oblique movements guided by trees, the installation teaches us about gay men of past generations and women's embodied practices, including healing with herbs, both vulnerable historically, and initiates us to a forgotten language dictated by the trees, leaving us with the idea of a solidarity that takes the shape of branching out rather than being closeted, and intensely relevant, needed today. Botany can perhaps be seen as comprised of all technologies of transmitting messages. And I conclude here with this simple message that returning to botany can be done, not just as dictated by a knowledge economy and its striving for objectivity claimed for profit, but to read for these past forgotten languages that are also both personal and beholden to a non-human language of plants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natanya and Antonia. Wow, this is like so generative, and I'm just aware of the only 7 minutes we have left. So I'm just looking to see if there's any questions coming up at the moment. But before that, I'd like to invite our speakers. So first of all, thank you to the speakers. This is incredible, right? You think plants, people think, you know, plants are just kind of there in the background, and they have this incredibly rich sort of cross these boundaries of science and film and literature, and it's immense. And so thank you so much for this. I just wonder, do any of the speakers want to say anything about these presentations before I sort of pass it over to the audience? If you'd like to make a comment on anything, you have the floor. And if not, we'll continue. So, audience members who'd like to ask a question, please click the raise hand button, but you're also welcome, I see, to type your questions directly into the chat window. So I'm going to raise them for the speakers. So let me see. I just see somebody has written especially Fagacy. So I'm not sure what Barbara wanted to say about that, so she could say some more. I do have a question here, or a comment that I'm going to read out from Harpo Faust. The overwhelming majority of the history presented today is represented by white cis men. And I'm curious if you found any history of queer women and gender non-conforming Black, Indigenous, and people of color in botany. It's a great question. And if you have any books or resources you would suggest to young botanists interested in learning about these underrepresented groups. Did everyone hear the question? Do you need me to repeat it? Okay, so please, I'll start with Matthew and we'll just like work our way down if you would like to comment on that.
No, that's an absolutely really important question. And in my own writing, just sort of focusing on NYBG staff, again, as part of the history of science, barriers have been put in place, blocking, in many cases, those people from formally engaging in what we would consider, the proper channels. So at least in terms of NYBG, there unfortunately haven't been, as far as I'm aware, any other people who would be part of this community who are not white cis men. But again, those histories might be there and we just don't know. I think one of the things that I touched on is even with Barnaby, who was out and everyone knew he was out, and that was just part of Barnaby, a lot of his history is still an oral history. There's a lot written about Barnaby, but a lot of the details still are oral and transmissed from one person to another. And so, again, lots to dig in there. Yeah.
Thanks, Matthew. Louise, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, in general, trying to tell a queer history is a really difficult thing for earlier years. I think, as Matthew's been pointing to, a lot of these sources have been deliberately destroyed. And so it feels like this unbelievable win in a lottery when you find a reference to something that you can possibly construct in a story. And that becomes, I think, even more difficult when we're talking about people who are excluded from these institutions and from these scientific research fields. And that really is a call for, for more scholars to join in and to be asking new questions and looking for new people whose stories haven't been included here. I think an interesting complication, at least for the early 20th century, is that there's a lot of, and I'm sure it gets even more difficult earlier on, the categories that we use to think through identity keep on changing in interesting ways. And so the difference between homosexuality and intersexuality, for instance, was not very clear to some of the investigators who, like Stomps, for instance, who was relating the two together. So there's a lot of hard work that needs to be done, and I welcome more scholars to help us with that.
Thanks, Louise. Natanya or Antonia, would you like to add something, or will I move on to the next question?
Oh, yes, just briefly, I think that's a fantastic and really necessary question. There's a whole history of feminist and queer speculative writing and fiction that includes the voices of women, and including in the early modern period that we talked about, and later on of non-binary and trans people and people of color. And I just want to mention a few names. I think art and literature are places where you're finding now a whole array of voices and a diversity of voices, and that we need to continue excavating the past to think about the histories that inform those voices. I want to mention the poet Oliver Bendorf, but also thinking about the works of the science fiction writer Octavia Butler, who takes up the question of the seed in really interesting and generative ways. So I want to thank the person in the chat for the question and say, yes, these voices are there, and we need to continue to lift them up. Antonia?
Antonia, you've no sound.
I think this whole idea of branching is to me such an exciting idea about, as I think Matthew just said, or Luis, I'm not sure which one of you, that the categories keep changing, that there are these sort of new solidarities, and I feel really excited about the way in which botanical language becomes sort of not goes from a closeted language, which is a little bit sad in itself, into this sort of language of new alliances. So yes, as Natanya mentioned, there are lots of examples of non-cisgender, non-white persons engaging in this, in reading plants and botanical forms. So.
Thank you so much. I know at the end of that question, the person asked about sources. And so I think we'll try and figure out a way to reach out to you with the library to sort of begin to discuss the types of sources that you can use for young, science-minded people. It's great. I just want to follow up. Barbara, I'm going to butcher her name, Archer, said that the joke was actually for you, Antonia, about Fagacy, the beach family, a joke that went with the trees are fags. So I had to pass that on to you. I have a very long question, so give me a minute to say it to you. And Charlie had said that we can go over a little bit over time, but I have two really important questions that I'd like to at least state. So the question is in these fascinating presentations, there seems an attention to the 19th century and prior to the long 18th century, which gestures to a wide range of approaches to studying queerness in moments of contacts between human actors and the natural world. This raises a question, though, of how we can observe queerness even with the normalizing practice of natural history. Therefore, where do you think, in the writings of natural historians and other botanical scientists, let me repeat that. Therefore, where do you think we can locate such contradiction in the writings of natural historians and other botanical scientists? And furthermore, how should we approach the botanical sciences in this moment of radical change? Antonia, would you like to pick this up because you left us with botanical language and we'll work backwards, or do you need a minute to?
I think I would appreciate the question.
I'll say it again.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, it raises a question though of how we can observe queerness even with the normalizing practices of natural history. Therefore, where do you think we can locate such contradiction in the writings of natural historians and other botanical scientists? Furthermore, how should we approach the botanical sciences in this moment of radical change?
That's a great question. It's a big question. Is the question about how to think about race in the botanical, in contemporary botany?
I get the impression from the question is that, in essence, how do you observe this queerness? Sort of in a way, and the person who wrote this question, please let me know if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, is that as Luis and Matthew and you all have noticed that the archives themselves have biases and silences, and so how do you observe the queerness within this sort of, over time, as modern botanical science begins to kind of form into this very kind of streamlined narrative that pushes away anything that's marginalized?
I can only give a brief answer, because I think the project that we are, it's a great project, I think, for our sort of archival libertarian botany project that we're undertaking with Netanya. I think we are reading these archives as personal stories, so and we're reading very strongly against the kind of view of, especially after Michel Foucault, of science as categorizing, right? Of early modern science as categorizing, which I think is still resonates in this question. So I would say that looked at it in this way, queerness and botany, or turning to plants, is sort of actually a multifarious event today. Everything from kind of ecological, queer ecological undertakings to non-white post-colonial efforts to bring sort of humans in relation to plants. So I think for us, it's actually more of a question of limiting the archive than, but we do understand that botany is a gatekeeping practice, and so for those people who engage in a scientific activity or study botany as a science, I think there are a whole different set of questions to be asked. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Antonia. Netanya, I'm just going to, oh, Louise, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, in my story, I was interested in following the history of mutation and trying to understand why it went from this kind of species organism level change to a gene level change. And I began to see that there was this category of chromosomal mutation that botanists totally talked about all the time and worked with, but that didn't seem to be there in the same way in the animal world. And as I was following through that history and that story, then I went into, these papers of De Vries, and they're literally in a closet in Amsterdam at the time. So this is literally bringing things out of the closet to try and tell. So I went into this not looking for a queer story, but finding one and uncovering one as a way and as part of an interest of a larger story in the history of genetics and how it was that our scientific categories have changed, and why was this plant kind of poo-pooed and denigrated for such a long time. And so there's many ways I think that we can come to telling queer stories from many different angles. And this story surprised me. And then once I began to see that maybe I could make a connection between what it means to be a practicing individual scientist and what it means to produce a normalized bit of scientific work, I found that a very interesting thing to pursue.
Thank you, Louise. Would Matthew or Netanya like to add anything?
May I add something?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
It's totally gone, out of order.
Just really briefly, I wanted to say that I think one of the aspects of early modernity that Antonia and I find inspiring is that even though people are operating under some incredibly repressive institutional, social, and cultural constraints, you do get this sense of early modern science as a really interdisciplinary activity. And so you can see the connections among different ways of kind of approaching the representation of nature, but also the way in which science and art in particular speak to one another. And I think that conversation is something that we need more of and can foster in contemporary contexts as well. So just want to sort of give a endorsement of the cross-pollination of science and art, which we do see in the early modern context.
So I just want to pick up on Netanya's comment, because that leads into something I was just thinking of. So both Barnaby and Ripley were both artists. Ripley had showings in New York. Again, they engaged with this really amazing bohemian art scene and seemingly knew every single major artist and sometimes not so major artist of the time and were patrons of them. And Barnaby was an accomplished artist himself. He drew many of his own line drawings that appear in his manuscripts. And he actually injured his hand in midlife in a rock gardening accident, and then actually retrained himself to use his previously non-dominant hand so he could then draw again. And again, as Natanya said, there's this amazing continuation of the connections between art and botany and science that has been there since the beginning. And, you know, again, spans beyond that. It's really just an open, amazing topic that we could go on for hours about.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I know that it's 9 minutes past 12, but I'd at least just like to give these questions out and have maybe some very brief comments. I don't want to cut you off. This is like the worst, like these incredible questions. So one question is probably more, if I can, sorry, find it now, is much more, I don't know if you can speak to it, you as a group, but one was, how do you intend to further queer the New York Botanic Gardens? And that's certainly something that I know that Carrie has mentioned in her introduction that she's interested in doing. So the question is, how do you queer the NYBG, and I'm going to extend that to cultural institutions, without including trans and non-binary voices of color in conversations like this? The last question, I'll give you time to answer this, but I'd like to get in the last question as well. If I can find it. Ooh. Sorry, it's after disappearing off my screen. It's from Hillary. Sorry, let me see, Hillary. I apologize if you can, I don't know if you guys can see it. Did
we read it for you, Nuala?
Yeah, it's gone off my screen. Thanks, Louise.
This is from Hillary Callahan. I wonder if any speakers can comment on a tension long recognized in history of women's botany. On the one hand, botany as an amateur yet serious avocation can be thought of as gender conforming for cis women, especially those whose lives include working as mothers. Sensu of Rousseau's Letters to a Lady, a Eurocentric text, nonetheless a key text. But participating in anything professionally is gender non-conforming, intended historically and even today in women remaining unmarried or unpartnered, and for those who did enter into committed opposite sex or same-sex relationships, never engaging in a parenting. Just super interesting because respecting and nurturing life is such a key part of botany.
Thanks, Louise. I appreciate that. I'll start with, if I give you two different types of questions, if you would like to add some last comments before we close out. Matthew, do you want to start and we'll go back down the line?
One of the things that I've sort of been struck by is botany has been one of the most, if not the most, and maybe sort of natural sciences in general, welcoming for queer people. And I think a key part of that is the participation of women, because botany in particular was seen as different than from studying animals. And this is a little bit outside of my area of specialties, but I do think that is a key component of it, and recognizing the role that women have played in botany, both professionally and non-professionally, however you want to categorize that, is really critical to understanding how botany has developed as a science and how we understand it today, and where it has come from. And that communication between women participating in science more broadly is really critical and absolutely fundamental.
Thanks, Matthew. Louise, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, the first thing that occurs to me is the case of Marie Stopes, who was a paleobotanist. And when Gates and Stopes were getting married and DeFries wrote to Gates to congratulate him, there was a reference saying that she didn't look like she would be an expert in fossils or something like that. But nonetheless, they thought this must be a mutant feature or something. So recognizing women's botanical knowledge was referred to in the congratulatory message that Gates and Stopes were getting at that time. And then she went on, of course, for these major efforts in eugenics and in family planning efforts, for which she's later known. So I think there's a really rich history there that many scholars have explored of Stokes's work in life.
Sorry, can I just jump in really quickly?
Please do.
Particular to New York Botanical Garden, our history is perhaps somewhat unique in that we were co-founded by a man and a woman, a husband and wife, Nathaniel Lord Britton and Elizabeth Britton. And Elizabeth Britton was a well-renowned bryologist in her own right. She studied mosses and other non-vascular plants. And so right here at the garden, you can say we sort of had a queer beginning in that we had this real dual partnership in our formation.
Thanks, Matthew. Antonia, Natanya, would you like to say anything to answer that question?
Sure. I just wanted to say that I think the problem of the kind of tension between institutional and political pressures and then these sort of possibilities that are latent in botany and in our connections with plants is one that libertine philosophy, at least, is very interested in, because libertines are understood as people who are not born free, but who render themselves free through thought and practice. And I think this is an important question, not just in the context of women's relationship to botany, but also in the context of botany as a colonial archive. I noticed very quickly in the chat that came up. Londa Scheidmaker's work in that archive also came up. But the question of how do we decolonize botany? How do we understand this colonial archive as a form of involved in violence, involved in trauma, but also containing within that violence and trauma moments of possibility, I think is a really key question. And we have to think historically to be able to answer it. But also speculative fiction thinks a lot about plants as ways of living that are not necessarily, that can reproduce, but not necessarily in sexual ways, or not necessarily in sexual dimorphic ways. So there's a lot of possibility, I think, for non-binary understandings of not just sexuality, but reproductive life that is inherent in plants. And speculative fiction takes that up, I think.
Thank you so much, Natanya. Antonia, would you like to add?
I just want to say that I think the question of the archives at a botanical garden is a really difficult problem, and I thank everybody who in the comments has asked about them. I think they are overwhelmingly European, and they are overwhelmingly white and heterosexual. The question of women's participation in botany is a bittersweet affair, obviously, because they have both been put in their places in botany, and they have been allowed to transform botany, as Matthew has said. So I think because we are in an era of queer and ecological affect that we are in awash in. There's a renewed kind of interest in botany and this botanical language, and I think we can gain from rethinking the archives, but I also think that I really agree that we have to work hard at being better readers of archives, of being better readers of unintelligible messages as well. So, and then back again to Natanya's point, I think there's something to learn from botany in that.
Mm-hmm. Nuala, if I could jump in on that.
Yeah,
one of the things that with the reference to non-binary identities, and the plant can help us understand how to think in non-binary ways as well. You know, so Oenothera in particular, having these chromosomes that can attach in these rings that can pass along to one daughter cell or the other, that can produce these incredible number of combinations for biological innovation, for evolutionary novelty. You know, up over 9 billion possible combinations of its chromosomes. And when I stumbled in the archive across a cytogeneticist, Cyril Darlington, who talked that these rings basically act like a unit in inheritance. And so he said that they affect the whole habit and structure of the plant, and they resemble the sex difference in animals. And so for me, that kind of brought out this major question here, that this is queering the very idea of non-binary sex to begin with. So did DeFries discover new species in his garden, a whole bunch of new species, or did he discover an incredible number of new sexes in one plant? And so this is a way that we can look to tell non-binary histories of botany that are not focused on people as our entry point, but are focused on rethinking how we talk about the biology of the plant. And I think Unathera is a great case for that.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, Antonia. It is 12:18. It's so unfortunate that we can't continue talking. There's, yeah, that thing called time, and people have lives, unfortunately. But I do want to thank, oh, Carrie, there you are.
No, I just, before you close, I want to thank everybody for attending today. And because this is recorded, I'm taking lots of notes. And I do think that, Nuala, your question is ginormous.
Yeah.
These are such big questions that I think the best way for us to go forward is to continue conversations, discussions. And when this was on our schedule, I knew it would be great. And it just confirms that we have to continue to do this kind of work, to engage our scholarly community, to ask, good, provocative and practical questions to which there may not be answers today. But the more that we can talk in open dialogue, the better off we'll be. And I know, Matthew's going to keep doing this work at the Botanical Garden. I'm so pleased. And I just want to thank the rest of you for joining us today, for going long. We could probably talk all afternoon. And Nuala, brilliant convening you've done today, really tapping into so much. Botanists, botany, plants, people, all the complexities between us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carrie. This has just been such an honor and a thrill, and thank you so much to the speakers. This has just been incredible. I know that people are going to be simmering and pondering the whole weekend over this. I just want to give you, if there's any last words that anyone would like to say, now is the time to do it before I say goodbye. I think we're good to go. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending this, and we look forward to more conversations.
Stay safe, everyone. Wear a mask.
Thank you, Nuala. Thank you, audience, as well, for the wonderful questions. And thank you, Carrie.
You're welcome.
Yes, I would like to thank everyone also.
Okay.
Bye.